Good day, dear listener. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and allow me to welcome you back to the gentle lanes of St. Mary Mead. I am delighted to present a brand new adventure featuring that most formidable of quiet observers, Miss Jane Marple. What appears to be a tragic suicide in the cozy confines of the Green Man Inn is about to unravel into something far more sinister. So settle in. You are perfectly safe. The only thing in danger here is the truth. Chapter 1. A Quiet Death at the Green Man. The village of St. Mary Mead lay sleeping under a thin, pale October sun, the sort of sunlight that seems to apologize for existing at all. A few bronze leaves, reluctant to leave their branches, drifted across the high street and came to rest against the war memorial as though paying their respects. From the tower of St. Mary's, the clock struck 3 with its usual unhurried dignity, and the sound floated over slate roofs and cottage gardens and the little green where the older men played bowls on Saturdays and argued about the rules on Sundays. At the far end of the high street stood the Green Man, the oldest inn in the parish, timbered and low-beamed, with diamond-paned windows that winked in the weak light. Its sign, freshly painted only last spring, showed a cheerful leafy giant raising a tankard to passers-by. Inside, however, all was far from cheerful. Rosemary Bates, only daughter of the landlord, Arthur Bates, and the undisputed beauty of St. Mary Mead for the past 5 years, had been found dead that morning. She was seated in the small private parlour behind the bar, the one with the chintz-covered armchairs and the bow window overlooking the herb garden. Her head had fallen forward a little, golden curls touching the half-written letter on her lap. One slender hand still held a fountain pen. On the table beside her lay an empty teacup on its saucer, a plate bearing the crumbs of a single slice of seed cake, and a small brown medicine bottle labeled Digitalis, to be taken as directed. The bottle, too, was empty. Old Dr. Haydock had been summoned at 8:30. He had climbed the stairs slowly. His own heart was none too strong these days, examined the body with frowning concentration, and come down 20 minutes later to pronounce, in a voice heavy with regret, that poor Rosemary had taken her own life. An overdose of her heart tonic, he said, a tragic, impulsive act brought on by low spirits. He had written the certificate himself and advised Mr. Bates that there was no need for any further unpleasantness. The funeral could be on Friday. The village accepted the verdict with sorrowful nods and a great many shakes of the head. Pretty Rosemary had always been highly strung, people said. She had taken after her poor mother, who had died of the same weakness of the heart. It was very sad, but these things happened, especially to girls who read too many novels and expected life to be like the pictures. By 4 o'clock, the news had traveled the length and breadth of St. Mary Mead, from the vicarage to the post office, from the Women's Institute to the dartboard in the Green Man itself. And by 4:20 it had reached the neat, red brick house with the well-tended garden just beyond the lich gate, where Miss Jane Marple sat knitting in her small drawing room. Cherry Baker, Miss Marple's housemaid companion, a cheerful young woman with an unquenchable interest in other people's tragedies, brought the tidings along with the afternoon tea tray. "It's Miss Rosemary Bates, ma'am, dead. Took her own heart medicine, they say. The whole village is upside down about it." Miss Marple's needles paused for no more than the space of a single stitch. "Dead," she repeated in her soft, precise voice. "Dear me. And they are quite sure it was deliberate?" Cherry set down the tray with a clatter of Crown Derby. "Dr. Haydock signed the certificate himself, ma'am. Suicide while the balance of her mind was disturbed. Poor Mr. Bates is taking it very hard." Miss Marple laid her knitting carefully in her lap and gazed out at the Michaelmas daisies nodding along the path. "Suicide," she murmured. "How very curious." Cherry waited expectantly. She had learned over the years that when Miss Marple said something was curious, It generally meant that somebody was about to be proved either a fool or a knave, and occasionally both. Miss Marple reached for the teapot. Rosemary Bates was not the sort of girl who would take her own life over a little unhappiness, she said, pouring with her usual steady hand. No, no. She had a great deal of character beneath that pretty exterior, and she was looking forward to something, Cherry. I noticed it only last week when she brought me the parish magazine. There was a letter in her handbag. The corner was sticking out, addressed in a gentleman's handwriting. She blushed quite pink when she saw that I had seen it. Cherry's eyes widened. A gentleman, ma'am? Undoubtedly. Miss Marple added a slice of lemon to her tea. Rosemary had expectations, Cherry. Girls with expectations do not swallow their medicine and die in chintz armchairs. Not when there are weddings to be planned and trousseaux to be bought. No, something is wrong here, very wrong indeed. She took a delicate sip and set the cup back in its saucer. I think, said Miss Marple, rising with the gentle determination of a vessel coming about in a high wind, that I shall put on my hat and take a short walk to the Green Man. One should always offer one's condolences in person on these sad occasions, and one never knows what one may notice over a cup of tea. Cherry watched her employer pin on a neat navy blue hat with a small velvet bow, draw on soft kid gloves, and select the ash walking stick with the duck's head handle that she used when she wished to appear frailer than she was. "Shall I come with you, ma'am?" she asked. "No, thank you, Cherry. I shall do very well alone, but you might ask Mrs. Bantry to telephone me this evening. I have a feeling I may have something to tell her." And with that, Miss Jane Marple stepped out into the golden autumn afternoon, her neat figure moving at a gentle but unswerving pace towards the Green Man, where a teacup still waited on a table and a half-written letter had not yet been read by the one person in St. Mary Mead who could make sense of both. The village, drowsing in its grief, had no idea that the most dangerous old lady in England had just taken the case. Chapter 2. The Scent of Foxgloves. The Green Man smelled exactly as an inn ought to smell on an October afternoon. Beeswax, hop-bittered air from the bar, a faint ghost of wood smoke from the great fireplace, and drifting through from the kitchen, the comforting promise of steak and kidney pie. Yet today the familiar scent seemed muted, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple stepped over the threshold at precisely 25 minutes to 5. The public bar was almost empty. Only old Mr. Thurchett nursed a half-pint in the ingle-nook and nodded to her as she passed. From the private parlour came the low sound of men's voices and the occasional blow of a nose into a large handkerchief. The door stood ajar. Miss Marple tapped gently with her stick and went in. Arthur Bates, the landlord, was seated in the very armchair in which his daughter had died. His broad shoulders were bowed, his grey head rested in his hands. Beside him stood Dr. Geoffrey Haydock, gaunt and stooping, a little grey about the gills himself. A third man, tall, soldierly, with a guardsman mustache going white at the tips, hovered uncertainly by the mantelpiece. Major Reginald Hargreaves, late of the 14th Hussars and now of Laburnum Cottage. All three looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple," Mr. Bates rose heavily. "That's kind of you, very kind. Won't you sit down?" "Thank you, Mr. Bates. I shall not keep you long. I only wish to say how very sorry I am and to ask whether there is anything at all I can do." The landlord shook his head. "Nothing anyone can do now, miss. My Rosie's gone." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "A terrible shock for all of us. I blame myself in a way. I prescribed the digitalis only last spring when she complained of palpitations. If I had been firmer about the dosage—" "Nonsense, doctor," the major interrupted brusquely. "Girl was always highly strung. Bad heart like her mother. Tragic, but there it is." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved gently about the room as the men spoke. Nothing had been much altered. The chintz armchair still bore the faint indentation of a slight body. On the mantelpiece stood a tall glass vase of foxgloves fresh that morning, their purple bells drooping a little now in the warm air. The small gate-leg table had been pushed back against the wall. The fatal teacup and medicine bottle had been removed, but a faint ring on the polished surface showed where the cup had stood. "Such beautiful foxgloves," Miss Marple murmured, drifting towards the vase as though drawn by the flowers themselves. "Rosemary always had an eye for arrangement, did she not? These must be almost the last of the season." Mr. Bates managed a watery smile. "She picked them herself yesterday afternoon. Said they reminded her of fairy bells when she was a child." Miss Marple bent to inhale the faint peppery scent. "Digitalis purpurea," she said softly, almost to herself. "So useful in its proper place, and so very dangerous when one is careless. One must be terribly particular when one is preparing one's own heart tonic, mustn't one, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock gave a nervous little start. "Quite so, quite so." Though in Rosemary's case the preparation was perfectly straightforward. A simple tincture of the leaves. "Leaves," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, of course. The leaves and the seeds are the most potent parts. The flowers themselves are almost harmless, I believe." She straightened, smoothing her gloves. "Well, I must not keep you gentlemen, Mr. Bates, if there is anything at all." The landlord pressed her hand. "Thank you, miss. You've always been a good friend to Rosie." Outside in the passageway, Miss Marple paused. From the bar came the clink of glasses and a low, angry murmur of voices. She moved quietly to the half-open door and looked in. Tom Briggs, the inn's barman, was polishing the same brass tap for the third time, his movements jerky. He was a sullen, handsome young man of 26 with a lock of dark hair that fell over one eye. At the far end of the bar sat Evelyn Prentice, Rosemary's half-sister, thin, colorless, and 32, staring into a glass of orange squash as though it might provide answers. Miss Marple stepped inside. "Good afternoon, Tom. Good afternoon, Miss Prentice." Tom flushed. "Afternoon, Miss Marple." Evelyn gave a little nod, her pale eyes red-rimmed but curiously dry. "I was so sorry to hear your sad news," Miss Marple said gently. "Rosemary was always so kind to me when I came in for my half-pint of shandygaff in the summer. Such a bright, happy girl." Evelyn's lips tightened. "Too bright, some people thought." Tom slammed a glass down with unnecessary force. "She were all right," he muttered. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the row of teapots on the shelf behind the bar. The big brown pub pot, the smaller one for ladies who took tea in the lounge, and on the end, a delicate rose-patterned pot with a chipped spout. "That was Rosemary's own pot, was it not?" she asked innocently. Tom nodded grudgingly. "She didn't like the thick stuff we brew for the commercials, always made her own in the little parlor." "How sensible," Miss Marple said. "And who washed it afterwards, I wonder?" Tom's cloth stilled. "I did. Soon as the doctor said it was all over. Didn't seem right to leave it standing." "Quite right," Miss Marple agreed. "Cleanliness is so important, especially when there has been medicine about." She bestowed a small, benevolent smile upon them both and sailed serenely out into the dusk. As she walked home along the lane, the first lamps were being lit in cottage windows. Somewhere a blackbird sang a few clear notes before nightfall. Miss Marple's lips moved soundlessly. "Foxgloves in October," she murmured. "A wash teacup, a medicine bottle that should have lasted another month, and 5 people who are all trying very hard not to look at one another." She tapped her stick once decisively against the pavement. Yes, said Miss Jane Marple to the quiet evening. I shall be taking rather a close interest in teapots from now on. Chapter 3, 5 People in 1 Teacup. That same evening, at 7:30 precisely, the Dane Mead lamp was lit in Miss Marple's small dining room. The fire crackled with apple wood, and her nephew Raymond Danvers and his wife Joan were finishing the last of Cherry's excellent steak and kidney pudding. Raymond, a novelist of moderate success and immoderate opinions, wiped his mouth and leaned back with the satisfied air of a man who has been well fed. Well, Aunt Jane, the village is buzzing like a hive of bees that has lost its queen. Suicide, they're all saying. Poor, pretty Rosemary Bates. Tragic waste. Joan, who wrote book reviews for a London weekly and affected scarlet lipstick even in the country, gave a little shiver. I always thought she was the type. Those huge violet eyes, always a little too bright. One could see the hysteria coming. Miss Marple, occupied with darning a small hole in a cashmere cardigan, did not look up. Did one? She asked mildly. How very observant of one. Raymond laughed. Come, come, Aunt Jane. You can't pretend you knew the girl well. She served behind the bar 3 nights a week and flirted with anything in trousers. Miss Marple's needle paused. Rosemary Bates, she said with gentle reproof, was a good deal shrewder than most people gave her credit for. She had a very clear head for figures. Her father left the accounts entirely to her these last 2 years. And she was saving quite determinedly. Joan raised an eyebrow. Saving for what? A trousseau? Precisely, said Miss Marple and bit off her thread with small, neat teeth. Raymond looked amused. You mean the girl had a follower? Who is the lucky man? Young Arthur Croft, the doctor's nephew, or that sulky barman of hers? Miss Marple folded the cardigan and laid it aside. All of those gentlemen and 1 or 2 others have been seen paying her marked attention at different times. But Rosemary was not the sort of girl to throw herself away. She intended to marry well or not at all. She rose and crossed to the mantelpiece where a small silver-framed photograph of her own fiancé, dead these 55 years, stood between the clock and a bowl of late roses. She adjusted the frame a fraction. 5 people, she said almost dreamily. All had excellent reasons to wish Rosemary silenced before she made up her mind which offer to accept. Joan leaned forward, eyes bright. 5? Do tell, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple ticked them off on her delicate fingers as though counting stitches. First, Major Hargreaves. He borrowed £500 from Rosemary last February, money from her mother's legacy, supposedly to repair the roof of Laburnum Cottage. The roof, I notice, is still leaking. The Major has been selling his metals 1 by 1 to a dealer in Much Benham. He could not possibly repay the debt, and Rosemary had begun to press him. Second, Mrs. Lavinia Croft. She believed quite wrongly that Rosemary was encouraging her precious Arthur to propose. Mrs. Croft has a tongue like a meat saw and a heart to match. She has been heard to say that certain young women ought to be horsewhipped for leading innocent boys astray. Third, Dr. Haydock himself. He signed the death certificate with what one might call unseemly haste. And his housekeeper, Mrs. Price, grows the most magnificent digitalis in her cottage border. She prepares the doctor's own heart tonic every autumn. A careless pinch too much. Well, mistakes do happen. Fourth, Tom Briggs, the barman. He and Rosemary were secretly engaged, or so he believed. But she had lately been returning his notes unopened. He was seen quarreling with her in the stable yard only last Thursday. Voices were raised, something about another man and you'll be sorry. And fifth, Miss Marple's voice softened until it was scarcely more than a breath. Poor Evelyn Prentice, Rosemary's half-sister, 32, plain and utterly devoted to her father. When old Mrs. Bates died, the money was left entirely to Rosemary. The pretty child, the beloved child. Evelyn gets nothing but a few £100 and the interest on a small trust. Unless, of course, Rosemary were to die unmarried. Then everything, the inn, the investments, the freehold cottages, passes to Evelyn. Joan gave a delighted little gasp. "Aunt Jane, you make it sound exactly like one of your own stories." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "But my dear, life is almost always exactly like one of my own stories. Human nature is so terribly limited in its variations: greed, fear, jealousy, misplaced love. Those are the colors on the palette. The picture may change, but the pigments remain the same." Raymond poured himself another glass of claret. "And which of your 5, Aunt Jane, do you think slipped the extra dose into the teacup?" Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting once more. "Oh, I haven't the least idea yet, but I noticed something this afternoon that interested me very much." She held the knitting to the light, frowning at a dropped stitch. "The teacup had been washed," she said, "spotlessly, almost before the body was cold. Now that is curious, don't you think? If a girl has taken poison in her medicine, one leaves the cup exactly as it is for the police, for the coroner, for the chemist to test. One does not whisk it away and scrub it with soap and soda." Joan shivered again, this time genuinely. "You mean someone wanted to hide the fact that the digitalis had been in the tea, not the medicine bottle?" "Exactly, my dear. Someone who knew that foxglove leaves, properly dried and crushed, are quite indistinguishable from the coarse tea Rosemary bought from the co-op. Someone who knew exactly how much would stop a heart." Miss Marple's needles began to click again, steady and comforting as a heartbeat. "But never fear," she said comfortably. "People always make mistakes. They cannot help it. And in St. Mary Mead, we notice mistakes. We notice everything." She smiled at her nephew and his wife over the dancing flames. "Another scone, Raymond, dear? And then I think we might have a nice game of patience before bed. It is so restful to the mind. One sees patterns emerging, just as one does in life." Outside, the October wind stirred the ivy on the wall, and the Michaelmas daisies bowed their heads as though the garden itself understood that the game had begun. Chapter 4. The Garden at Twilight. The following 5 days passed in the gentle, deceptive quiet that St. Mary Mead does so well. The leaves fell a little faster, the nights drew in, and the village prepared for Rosemary Bates's funeral with the subdued efficiency of a community that has buried its own many times before. Black armbands appeared on sleeves, the bell ringers practiced a muffled peal, and Mrs. Baker at the post office sold out of mourning stationery twice over. Miss Marple, however, was far from idle. Each afternoon at 3:45, she took the same slow, deliberate walk. Down the lane, past the Lich Gate, along the High Street, and then, apparently by chance, past the side gate of the Green Man. She always carried a small basket and a pair of secateurs, giving every appearance of an elderly lady in search of a late chrysanthemum or a sprig of rosemary for remembrance. No one thought it odd. Miss Marple had been cutting flowers from other people's gardens for 70 years and always asked permission first. Yet every day she noticed something new. On Monday she observed that the bed of foxgloves beneath the parlor window was unusually lush for so late in the year. Someone had been feeding them well, fish manure perhaps, or the strong liquid from the inn stables. The lower leaves were enormous, dark green, faintly hairy, perfect for drying. On Tuesday she paused to speak to old Mr. Polk, who was sweeping the yard. "Terrible thing, Miss Marple, terrible. My missus can't sleep for thinking of it." "Very sad," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, Mr. Polk, did Miss Rosemary seem herself when you saw her last?" Right as rain, miss. Laughing and singing in the garden not 2 hours before. Before it happened. Said she was expecting company that afternoon and wanted the place looking nice. Company? Miss Marple repeated softly. How interesting. On Wednesday, she encountered Major Hargreaves coming out of the post office with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He looked hotter than the mild day warranted and attempted to hide the parcel behind his back. Afternoon, Major. Sending something to be valued, perhaps? The Major went scarlet. No, just an old regimental badge to be cleaned. Nothing of importance. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Of course, one likes to keep one's treasures bright. That evening, from her bedroom window, she watched a thin plume of smoke rise from the Major's garden incinerator long after dusk. Paper burns with a peculiarly white flame, she noted. On Thursday, she met Dr. Haydock on his rounds. He looked 10 years older. The hand holding his bag trembled slightly. Working you hard, Doctor? These shocks take it out of one, he said with a wan smile. And my own ticker's been playing up again. Mrs. Price has had to double the strength of my infusion. Dear me, murmured Miss Marple. One must be so careful with dosage. The doctor flinched as though she had struck him. On Friday, the day of the funeral, she walked past the inn again at 4 o'clock sharp. Tom Briggs was in the yard splitting kindling with unnecessary violence. There was a fresh scratch across the back of his left hand, 3 parallel lines angry and red. Rosethorn? Miss Marple inquired sweetly. Tom scowled. Something of the sort. How unfortunate, though I always think the hybrid teas at the Green Man are remarkably free of thorns. Rosemary saw to that. She hated being pricked. Tom brought the axe down with a thud that buried the blade deep in the block. That same afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Miss Hartnell, who had been helping Evelyn Prentice with the funeral flowers in the church. Such a trying time for poor Evelyn, Miss Hartnell boomed. Though between ourselves she has ordered rather a smart new black coat and skirt from Madame Lucy. 2 weeks ago, if you please. Said she needed it for the winter. Miss Marple's eyes opened very wide. 2 weeks ago, before her sister's sad passing? Miss Hartnell nodded meaningfully. Some might call it four-handed. I merely call it odd. Miss Marple walked home through the churchyard where the grave stood newly dug, a raw rectangle of earth against the ancient yews. She paused for a moment, head bowed, then continued on her way. That evening she sat before her fire with a small notebook on her knee and a pencil held lightly between her fingers. She wrote 5 names, one beneath the other. Major Reginald Hargreaves, Mrs. Lavinia Croft, Dr. Geoffrey Haydock, Tom Briggs, Miss Evelyn Prentice. Beside each name she added a brief note. Major, burning papers, selling medals, terrified of exposure, Mrs. Croft. Mentioned horsewhipping to Mrs. Bantry only last month. Doctor, trembling hands. Stronger medicine, hasty certificate, Tom. Scratch, washed teacup, quarrel in stable yard, Evelyn. New black coat, ordered 20th September. She underlined the date twice. Then beneath them all she wrote a single line. Someone entered the parlor between 3:45 and 4:30. Someone added crushed foxglove leaf to the rose-patterned teapot. Someone knew Rosemary took her tea weak, without milk, at 4 o'clock precisely. Someone knew exactly how much would kill. Miss Marple closed the notebook and laid it on the table beside her spectacle case. Tomorrow, she said aloud to the quiet room, is the funeral. Everyone will be there. Everyone will be watching everyone else. And someone will make a mistake. Cherry came in to draw the curtains. Will you be wearing your black velvet, ma'am, or the wool with the jet beads? The wool, I think, Cherry. One does not wish to be overdressed. And Cherry? Yes, ma'am. If anyone should telephone while I am at the service, say that I shall be home by 4:30. I have invited several people to tea afterwards. A little gathering, you know, to remember Rosemary properly. Cherry's eyes grew round. All the village, ma'am? No, only 5. And Dr. Haydock, of course. And Sir Henry Clithering, if he is able to come down from London. Cherry gave a delighted gasp. Sir Henry, then it's... Miss Marple raised a delicate hand. It is merely tea, Cherry, though I dare say we may find 1 or 2 things to talk about. People are always so much more themselves when they are holding a cup and saucer. She picked up her knitting again, the needles moving with calm precision. Outside, the October moon rose pale and full above the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, laying a silver path across the garden and touching the foxgloves at the Green Man, with a light almost as treacherous as their own poison. Tomorrow, thought Miss Marple, the net would begin to close, very gently, very politely, but quite irresistibly. Chapter 5. A Second Opinion. Saturday dawned soft and sorrowful, the sky the color of wet pearl. By 10:30, the churchyard was already filling, black coats, black hats, black gloves, and the subdued murmur of a village paying its respects. The bell tolled 9 slow notes for Rosemary's 24 years. And then the muffled peal began. Miss Marple, in her black wool with the jet beads, stood a little apart beneath the yew tree, her gloved hands resting lightly on the duck's head handle of her stick. She watched everything. Major Hargreaves arrived late, breathing hard, his medals replaced by a single row of miniature ribbons that looked somehow forlorn. Mrs. Lavinia Croft sailed in like a brigantine under full sail, her veil so thick it was impossible to tell whether she wept or merely disapproved of the weather. Dr. Haydock, pale and stooping, supported old Mr. Bates on his arm. Tom Briggs, in an ill-fitting black suit, kept his eyes on the ground. Evelyn Prentice walked alone, upright, the new black coat fitting her as though it had always belonged to her. The coffin was lowered. A single wreath of white roses, paid for, Miss Marple noted, by someone who could ill afford it, lay on the mound of earth. Then the little crowd began to drift away, breaking into knots of conversation like dark birds settling after flight. Miss Marple did not follow them to the inn for the funeral meets. Instead, she walked briskly to the lich gate where a large, comfortable Daimler stood waiting. Sir Henry Clithering, retired Commissioner of Scotland Yard, and an old friend climbed out to greet her. "My dear Jane," he said, kissing her cheek, "you look exactly the same as you did when you solved the case of the vanishing bridegroom in 1932. I came as soon as your telegram arrived, though I must say I'm still not clear why." Miss Marple took his arm. "Because, Henry, I require a second medical opinion, and I do not entirely trust the first. Come, we will take a little drive to Much Benham. There is a chemist there who trained under my nephew Raymond's father-in-law. He is most obliging." On the drive, she told him everything. The washed teacup, the luxuriant foxgloves, the 5 suspects, the medicine bottle that should have lasted another month, the letter Rosemary had been writing when she died. Sir Henry listened in silence, his shrewd eyes half closed. "And the local doctor signed the certificate without hesitation, within 20 minutes of pronouncing her dead." Sir Henry gave a low whistle. "That is remarkably prompt." At Much Benham, they drew up before a small, old-fashioned pharmacy with gold lettering on the window. Mr. Willis, the chemist, greeted Miss Marple with pleasure and Sir Henry with cautious respect. "I have brought you a little puzzle, Mr. Willis," Miss Marple said, producing from her handbag a small twist of paper. "These fragments were found clinging to the spout of a teapot. Could you tell me what they are?" Mr. Willis adjusted his spectacles, tipped the fragments into a white dish, and bent over them. "Dried leaf particles," he said after a moment. "Foxglove, digitalis purpurea, finely crushed, Enough here for a fatal dose if steeped in a single pot of tea. Sir Henry's eyebrows rose. You are certain? Perfectly. And there is something else. The chemist held the dish to the light. These leaves have been dried slowly at low heat. See the color? Someone took great care. This was not an accident of garden rubbish swept into a teapot. This was deliberate preparation. Miss Marple thanked him with a gentle smile and a promise of a jar of cherries damson jelly. In the car on the way back, Sir Henry lit a cigarette and stared out at the sodden fields. You realize what this means, Jane. If Haydock signed a certificate knowing the poison was administered in tea and not from the medicine bottle, then he is either criminally negligent or actively concealing a murder, Miss Marple finished calmly. Yes. That is why I needed you, Henry. A village doctor is a little king in his own kingdom. No one questions him, but you can. Sir Henry tapped ash into the ashtray. And the motive? Miss Marple gazed at a solitary oak standing black against the sky. Rosemary discovered something about Dr. Haydock. Something that would ruin him. He has been indiscreet with a married woman in the next parish. There is also the matter of £500 he borrowed from the Major to buy jewelry for this lady. Rosemary held the promissory note. She was pressing for repayment. Sir Henry gave a short laugh. Good Lord, the old fool. Old fools, said Miss Marple, can be the most dangerous of all when they are frightened. They reached St. Mary Mead as the church clock struck 3. Sir Henry dropped Miss Marple at her gate. I shall telephone the chief constable, he said quietly. Discreetly. There will have to be an exhumation and a proper analysis. Miss Marple laid a hand on his sleeve. Not yet, Henry. Tomorrow I am giving a little tea party. All 5 of our friends will be present, and Dr. Haydock too. I have a small experiment in mind. After that, if I am right, the doctor will confess without any need for unpleasantness. Sir Henry looked at her with affectionate exasperation. You haven't changed a bit, Jane. You still prefer to catch your murderers with a scone instead of a warrant. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. People are always more truthful when their mouths are full, Henry. It is one of the great advantages of civilized life. She watched the Daimler glide away, then turned in at her own gate. Cherry was waiting in the hall, apron starched, eyes bright with excitement. Everything is ready, ma'am. Victoria sponge, 2 kinds of sandwich, your best Brown Betty teapot, and the special tea you asked for in the caddy marked Assam. Miss Marple removed her hat and smoothed a stray wisp of white hair. Excellent, Cherry, and the other caddy, the one marked gunpowder? In the cupboard, ma'am, just as you said. Miss Marple allowed herself the very smallest of smiles. Then we are ready. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock the teapot will speak for itself, and someone, I think, will find it quite impossible to swallow. She climbed the stairs slowly, leaning on the banister, already rehearsing in her mind the exact words she would use when the moment came. Behind her, the grandfather clock, in the hall, struck the quarter, steady and unhurried, counting down the hours to a revelation as inevitable as afternoon tea in an English village. Chapter 6. The letter that wasn't finished Sunday dawned bright and almost indecently cheerful, as though the weather itself wished to mock the village's mourning. Golden light slanted across the churchyard where a single bunch of wilted white roses lay on the fresh grave. By 3 o'clock, Miss Marple's small drawing-room was ready. Fire blazing, lamps lit against the shortening day, and the gate-leg table extended to its fullest to accommodate 7. Cherry had surpassed herself. There were paper-thin cucumber sandwiches, egg and cress, scones still warm from the oven, black currant jam, clotted cream, a dark fruit cake fragrant with brandy, and the Victoria sponge filled with Cherry's own raspberry preserve. In the center stood the best Brown Betty teapot, wearing its quilted cozy like a coronation robe. At 5 minutes to 4, the guests began to arrive. Major Hargreaves came first, blustering about the cold and clearly wishing himself 100 miles away. Mrs. Lavinia Croft followed, nostrils flared as though she suspected poison in the very air. Dr. Haydock appeared last of the 5, thinner than ever, his eyes red-rimmed behind his spectacles. Tom Briggs had been persuaded to leave the bar for an hour and stood awkwardly just inside the door, twisting his cap. Evelyn Prentice, in her new black coat, sat bolt upright on the edge of a chintz chair as though ready to spring up and flee. Sir Henry Clithering, urbane and impeccably turned out, arrived with the doctor and took his place quietly beside the fireplace. Miss Marple greeted them all with her usual fluttering benevolence. "How kind of you to come. In times of sorrow one clings to old friends. Do sit down. Cherry will pour." Conversation began stiffly. The Major talked too loudly about the weather. Mrs. Croft dissected the shortcomings of the new curate. Tom stared at the carpet. Evelyn's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that the knuckles showed white. At a signal from Miss Marple, Cherry lifted the cozy and began to pour the tea. It was a good brew, strong and dark, exactly as St. Mary Mead liked it. The cups went round, scones were handed, the room filled with the gentle clink of porcelain and the small, safe noises of an English tea party. Miss Marple waited until every cup was filled and every plate held at least one sandwich. Then she spoke, softly, conversationally. "I have always believed," she said, "that teapots are the most revealing of all household objects. One can tell so much from the leaves, don't you agree, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock started so violently that tea slopped into his saucer. "Leaves?" he repeated hoarsely. "Yes, the way they cling to the spout, for instance." Miss Marple set down her own cup and lifted the lid of the Brown Betty. "Cherry, dear, would you tilt the pot a little towards the light?" Cherry obeyed. Every eye in the room followed the movement. Clinging to the inside of the spout exactly as they had clung to the spout of Rosemary's rose-patterned pot were unmistakable fragments of crushed, dried foxglove leaf. Purple-brown, papery, lethal. There was a moment of absolute silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Croft gave a small, strangled scream. The Major's mustache bristled like a frightened cat. Tom Briggs went the color of tallow. Dr. Haydock rose slowly to his feet. The cup fell from his hand and shattered on the hearth. "It was an accident," he whispered. "I swear before God it was an accident." Miss Marple looked at him with great compassion. "No, Doctor," she said gently. "It was not." She reached into her handbag and drew out a single sheet of blue writing paper, folded once. "Rosemary was writing this letter when she died. I retrieved it yesterday from the office drawer at the inn. Dear Mr. Bates had quite forgotten it in his grief. Shall I read it to you?" No one answered. No one could. Miss Marple unfolded the letter and began to read in her soft, precise voice. "My dearest Tom, I have made a terrible mistake. I know now that you never loved me, only the money Father will leave me. Last night I saw you with—" Here the writing trailed away, the pen had fallen from a dying hand. Miss Marple laid the letter on the table. "But that was only part of what Rosemary had discovered," she continued quietly. "The rest concerned Dr. Haydock. She had found among the Major's papers that he had left in the parlour for safekeeping a promissory note for £500 signed by the doctor. And she had seen the doctor on more than one occasion visiting a certain cottage in Little Paddocks after dark, a cottage occupied by a married lady whose husband is unfortunately abroad." Dr. Haydock made a sound like a wounded animal. "She threatened to tell Mrs. Haydock everything unless the money was repaid by Michaelmas. The doctor could not repay it. He had spent it on jewelry that is now, I believe, in the process of being returned to the shop in Much Benham." The Major gave a groan and covered his face. On the afternoon of her death, Miss Marple went on, Dr. Haydock called at the inn, ostensibly to see Mr. Bates about his rheumatism. While Rosemary was in the garden cutting her beloved foxgloves, he went to the kitchen cupboard where her personal teapot was kept. He carried in his bag a small bottle of concentrated digitalis solution, 10 times the usual strength, prepared for emergencies. He believed he was pouring a harmless sleeping dose, enough to make her drowsy, confused, unable to speak coherently when she confronted him later. He thought it would gain him time. She looked at the broken cup on the hearth, but he took the wrong bottle, and Rosemary drank her tea at 4 o'clock exactly as she always did. By 20 past, she was dead. Dr. Haydock swayed. Sir Henry rose quietly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think, Geoffrey," he said not unkindly, "you had better come with me." The doctor looked once wildly around the room, at the tea table, the shocked faces, the accusing fragments in the teapot, and then his head fell forward. "Yes," he said so low that only Miss Marple heard him. "God help me. Yes." And that was the end of the tea party. Chapter 7. The Truth in the Garden. The drawing room at Dane Mead had never seemed so small. The fire still crackled, the lamps still glowed, yet the air felt suddenly thin, as though all the warmth had been sucked out of the room and blown away on an October wind. Dr. Haydock stood between Sir Henry Clithering and the door, swaying like a man on the deck of a sinking ship. His spectacles had slipped to the end of his nose. Behind the lenses, his eyes were those of a frightened child. Miss Marple sat very upright in her little armchair, hands folded in her lap, the picture of elderly calm. Only the faintest tremor in her voice betrayed that she, too, felt the weight of what had just happened. Sir Henry spoke first quietly, but with the authority of Scotland Yard still clinging to him like pipe smoke. "Geoffrey, old man, you know what has to happen now. But if you come with me willingly, it will be easier for everyone, especially for poor Mrs. Haydock." The doctor gave a convulsive nod. A single tear slid down the groove beside his nose and hung on his chin. Miss Marple rose. She crossed the room with the soft rustle of bombazine and laid her small gloved hand on the doctor's sleeve. "Before you go," she said gently, "there are 1 or 2 things I should like to make plain, so that no one else need suffer unnecessary pain." She turned to the others who had not moved from their chairs, as though frozen into a tableau of shock. "Major Hargreaves," she began, "your debt to Rosemary dies with Dr. Haydock's disgrace. The promissory note will be destroyed. No one outside this room need ever know about the medals." The Major made a choking sound and pressed a hand to his mouth. "Mrs. Croft," Miss Marple continued, "your son Arthur was never in danger from Rosemary. He is, at this moment, buying an engagement ring for the squire's daughter in Much Benham. I happened to notice the receipt when he left his jacket in the cloakroom at the Women's Institute." Mrs. Croft's veil quivered. Whether from relief or indignation, it was impossible to tell. "Tom Briggs," Miss Marple's voice softened. "Rosemary had forgiven you. The letter you feared would accuse you of betraying her was going to say that she had seen you returning a scarf to the barmaid from the Blue Boar. Nothing more. She loved you, Tom. She was going to marry you after all." Tom's face crumpled. He turned away, shoulders shaking. "And Evelyn." Miss Marple's gaze rested last and longest on the plain woman in the new black coat. "You may keep your inheritance without guilt. The money was never yours by love, but it is yours by law. Spend it kindly, my dear. That is all any of us can do with what we are given." Evelyn Prentice stared at her for a long moment, then gave a single stiff nod. Miss Marple returned to Dr. Haydock. "You will want to know how I knew," she said. It was never one large clue, Doctor. It was many small ones, the sort of things people notice in a village and think unimportant. She began to count them on her fingers as calmly as if she were reciting a recipe. The foxgloves in the inn garden were fed all summer on stable manure. Your own prescription for strong plants. Your housekeeper dries the leaves for your tonic in the greenhouse loft. I smelled them there when I called for the parish magazine. You were seen burning letters the night Rosemary died. Letters she had written to you. Your hand trembled when you signed the death certificate. I saw it from the doorway. And finally, Miss Marple looked at the brown Betty teapot. The fragments in my own pot this afternoon came from the emergency bottle you left in my safekeeping last spring when you feared your heart might fail during the church fete. I had Cherry brew them today, under strict supervision, so that you would see exactly what you had done. Dr. Haydock closed his eyes. I meant only to quiet her, he whispered. A few hours' sleep, time to think. I never imagined... He could not finish. Sir Henry took his arm. Come along, Geoffrey, the car is outside. They moved towards the door. At the threshold, the doctor paused and looked back once, at the tea table still laid with its innocent burden of scones and sandwiches, at the firelight flickering on shocked faces, at Miss Marple standing small and indomitable among the ruins of his life. I am sorry, he said, and it was impossible to tell whether he spoke to Rosemary, to the village, or to himself. Then he was gone. The front door closed with soft finality. The Daimler purred away down the lane. For a long minute no one spoke. It was Major Hargreaves who broke the silence. He stood up stiff and soldierly again, though his eyes were wet. I think, he said gruffly, we had better all go home. Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. One by one they left, Mrs. Croft with a rustle of disapproval, Tom Briggs without a word, Evelyn Prentice last of all, pausing to press Miss Marple's hand in silence. When the room was empty, save for Cherry hovering anxiously in the doorway, Miss Marple sank back into her chair. She looked suddenly very old and very tired. Clear away now, Cherry dear, she said. And then bring me a fresh cup, just milk, no sugar. I find I have quite lost my taste for tea this evening. Cherry hesitated. Was it very dreadful, ma'am? Miss Marple gazed into the fire. It is always dreadful when someone discovers that good intentions are not enough. Dr. Haydock was not an evil man. He was a weak one, and weakness allowed to grow unchecked can poison more surely than any foxglove. She sighed, a small, sad sound. Poor Rosemary. She wanted only to be loved for herself, not for her pretty face or her father's money. And in the end she was killed by a man who loved her not at all. Cherry carried out the tray, plates untouched, the Victoria sponge still perfect and unbroken. Outside, the October dusk deepened into night. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang the hour, and the wind stirred the Michaelmas daisies along the path, as though the garden itself were turning over in its sleep, trying to forget the taste of poison. Chapter 8. Morning Tea and Understanding. A week later, on a bright, cold morning that tasted of wood smoke and the first promise of frost, Miss Marple sat in her small breakfast room with the French windows open to the garden. The Michaelmas daisies had been cut back, the last roses brought indoors, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of bonfire from somewhere down the lane. Cherry placed the tray on the table. Brown toast in a silver rack, a single boiled egg in a blue cozy butter shaped like a shell, and the small Crown Derby teapot that Miss Marple used when she wished to feel particularly civilized. You'll never guess who I saw in the post office, ma'am, Cherry said, unable to contain herself any longer. Dr. Haydock's housekeeper, Mrs. Price. She's leaving for her sister in Torquay this very afternoon, and the house is already up for sale. Miss Marple poured her tea with the same steady hand she had used on the day of the dreadful tea party. Poor woman, she murmured. It was not her fault that her employer mistook one bottle for another, though I dare say she will be happier by the sea. Cherry buttered toast with vigor. And they say Mrs. Haydock has gone to her brother in Scotland. Took only one suitcase. The village is buzzing like a beehive, ma'am. Some say he meant it all along, some say it was an accident, and old Miss Hartnell told Mrs. Baker that you ought to have let the police handle it from the first instead of serving poisoned tea to half the parish. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled over the rim of her cup. I served perfectly harmless tea, Cherry. The foxglove leaves had been steeped 3 times already. There was not enough left to stupefy a kitten. It was the sight of them that mattered. Dr. Haydock convicted himself the moment he saw the spout. Cherry considered this and nodded slowly. Well, it worked, didn't it? He confessed right there on your hearthrug. Sir Henry told my cousin at the station that he'd never seen anything like it in 30 years at the yard. Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied sigh. People will betray themselves if one gives them the right setting. A cup of tea, a quiet room, the knowledge that their neighbors are listening. Those are powerful things in an English village. She set the cup down and gazed out at the garden where a robin was scolding the empty flower beds. Dr. Haydock will be charged with manslaughter, I imagine. The Crown will accept his plea that he intended only a sedative. He is 63 and in poor health. The sentence will not be long. And Rosemary will have justice of a sort. Cherry hesitated. And the others, ma'am? The Major and Mrs. Croft and poor Miss Prentice? The Major has booked a passage to East Africa to stay with his married sister. He leaves on Friday. Mrs. Croft has discovered that her son is safely engaged to the squire's daughter and has taken to her bed with nervous prostration, though I noticed she was well enough to attend the Harvest Festival committee yesterday. Evelyn has engaged a very competent manager for the inn and is talking of turning the upstairs into a tea room for summer visitors. She asked my advice about chintz curtains only yesterday. Cherry laughed. So everything is tidy again. As tidy as life ever manages to be, Miss Marple corrected gently. There will be talk for a while and then someone's cow will stray. Or the Women's Institute will quarrel over the Christmas bazaar and Rosemary will become one more sad, pretty ghost in the churchyard. That is the mercy of villages, Cherry. We remember, but we do not nurse grudges forever. She reached for the newspaper, shook it open, and turned to the crossword. Though I must say, she added thoughtfully, I shall never again look at a foxglove without a slight shiver. Such a beautiful flower and so very treacherous. Rather like people, don't you think? Cherry gathered the tray. Will there be anything else, ma'am? Only one thing. Miss Marple laid down her pencil and looked up with the small, serene smile that had ended more than one murderer's career. Next time you make scones, Cherry dear, we might try a little less baking powder and a little more care with the oven. Even justice should be accompanied by perfect lightness. Cherry grinned and bobbed a curtsy. Yes, ma'am, perfect lightness it is. She went out, closing the door softly behind her. Miss Marple returned to her crossword. Outside, the robin gave one last indignant chirp and flew off towards the church tower. The sun climbed higher, gilding the rooftops of St. Mary Mead and touching the fresh grave where white chrysanthemums now stood in a neat copper vase. Life, having been thoroughly shaken, had settled back into its familiar teacup. The leaves at the bottom might spell warning to those who could read them, but the surface was calm, fragrant, and perfectly English. Miss Marple filled in 14 across, poisonous plant 9, with a neat, decisive stroke. Foxglove, she murmured and turned the page. Soft strings rise gently. Narrator, warm, smiling. And so another teapot is emptied, another secret laid to rest beneath the quiet earth of St. Mary Mead. Thank you, dear listener, for walking these autumn lanes with Miss Marple and with me. Until the next cup is poured and the next whisper of danger stirs the Michaelmas daisies. Good day. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The drawing room at Mead had never felt so airless. The October afternoon had turned dull and sullen, a low sky pressed against the windows like wet flannel. Inside, the fire spat and hissed, throwing restless shadows across the tea table where the plates of untouched scones and sandwiches looked suddenly absurd, as though a children's party had been overtaken by a wake. 6 people sat in a rough circle, pinned by the gentle, inexorable voice of the old lady in the high-backed chair. Major Hargreaves's scarlet face had faded to the color of old putty. Mrs. Lavinia Croft's gloved hands were clenched so tightly that the kid leather squeaked. Tom Briggs stood with his back to the door, cap crushed in his fists, eyes fixed on the carpet as though it might open and swallow him. Evelyn Prentice sat bolt upright, pale and expressionless, a black-gloved statue. Dr. Geoffrey Haydock had risen to his feet the moment the foxglove fragments were revealed. He swayed now like a tree in a gathering storm. Only Sir Henry Clithering, leaning against the mantelpiece with the quiet authority of Scotland Yard, seemed entirely at his ease. Miss Marple laid the unfinished letter upon the table beside the brown Betty teapot, smoothing it with one small, deliberate hand. "Rosemary wrote this," she said, with the pen still warm from her fingers. She had discovered far more than a flirtation with a barmaid Tom. She had discovered greed, deceit, and terror in several hearts, and one of those hearts decided she must be silenced. She turned to Dr. Haydock. "You came to the inn at 3:45 on the afternoon of the 6th of October, Doctor. Mr. Bates was dozing in the kitchen. The maids were at the back washing linen. Rosemary was in the garden cutting the last of her foxgloves for the parlor vase. You went straight to the shelf where her little rose-patterned teapot was kept. You carried in your bag 2 bottles, one labeled Digitalis, 1 teaspoon as required, the other, smaller, darker, labeled Emergency Concentrate, 10 times normal strength. You had prepared it yourself for a patient who died before it was needed. You told yourself you only wished to make her sleep 4, perhaps 5 hours, so that you could reason with her, persuade her, buy time. You poured what you believed was a harmless dose into the dry pot. Then you added the tea leaves on top so carefully, so neatly. When Rosemary came in humming, she filled the kettle, warmed the pot, poured her usual weak tea without milk, and drank it in 7 minutes. By 4:17 she was drowsy. By 4:25 she was dead. Dr. Haydock made a small, hoarse sound. You knew the symptoms would be identical to an overdose of her own medicine. You returned at 4:30, discovered the body, expressed regret, and signed the certificate at once. No inquest, no post-mortem, no awkward questions. And you instructed Tom to wash the teapot immediately. Best not to upset the father further, you said. Didn't you, Tom? Tom Briggs flinched as though whipped. I thought I was helping, he muttered. Mrs. Croft found her voice at last, thin and shrill. This is monstrous. Dr. Haydock has attended my family for 30 years. Which is precisely why he believed he could never be suspected, Miss Marple replied gently. But pride goeth before a fall, Mrs. Croft, and fear is a poor counselor. She turned back to the doctor. You have been treating Mrs. Daphne Reeves of Little Paddocks for nerves twice a week. Her husband is in Malaya. The necklace you bought her, sapphires and diamonds, was charged to your account at Hedges & Son in Much Benham. Rosemary saw the bill when she was settling the Major's papers. She also held your promissory note for £500, money the Major borrowed from her to lend to you. She gave you until Michaelmas to repay. Michaelmas was the 8th of October. You had 2 days left. The Major groaned and buried his face in his hands. Dr. Haydock's voice, when it came, was a thread. I never meant murder. Only time. A few hours, I swear it. Miss Marple looked at him with infinite compassion. I believe you. That is why this will be manslaughter, not murder. But a young girl is dead all the same, Doctor, because you thought your reputation worth more than her life. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Then Evelyn Prentice spoke for the first time, low and clear. Will there be an exhumation? Sir Henry answered. There will have to be, Miss Prentice. Formalities, but the verdict is no longer in doubt. Evelyn nodded once, as though a weight had been lifted rather than added. Mrs. Croft rose suddenly, gathering her furs. I refuse to remain in a room where such accusations. Miss Marple's voice cut across the rustle of sable, soft, but unbreakable. Sit down, Lavinia. We are not quite finished. Mrs. Croft sat. Miss Marple addressed them all, slowly, deliberately. Major Hargreaves, your medals are safe. No one outside this room will ever know. Mrs. Croft, your son is betrothed to Miss Blake Thomas. He never looked twice at Rosemary after the tennis club dance. Tom. Rosemary forgave you the barmaid before she died. Evelyn, the money is yours by law. Spend it as you think best. And Dr. Haydock. She paused, her pale eyes steady. You will come with Sir Henry now. There has been enough cruelty. The doctor looked round the room once, at the tea table, the fire, the shocked, stricken faces, and then his shoulders sagged. Yes, he said simply. Enough. Sir Henry stepped forward and took his arm, not roughly, but with the quiet finality of handcuffs that need never be seen. At the door, Dr. Haydock paused. Tell Mrs. Haydock. Tell her I am sorry, he whispered. Then they were gone. The front door closed. The Daimler started and faded into the dusk. For a long moment no one moved. Miss Marple was the first to speak, her voice as calm as though she were announcing the winner of the flower show. Cherry will bring fresh tea, she said, and then I think we might all go home. Outside, the first street lamp flickered on, casting a small, steady pool of light across the lane. Somewhere a blackbird sang once, clear and unafraid, before the night folded its wings over St. Mary Mead. The teapot, emptied of its terrible leaves, waited in silence for the kettle to boil again. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Understanding. A week later, the first real frost of November lay like powdered glass across the garden at Danemead. The Michaelmas daisies had been cut down, the last roses brought indoors, and the lawn sparkled in the pale, slanting light. Miss Jane Marple sat on the little iron seat beneath the beech tree, well wrapped in a Shetland shawl the color of heather, a small table drawn up beside her. A woolen rug lay across her knees, though she insisted she was perfectly warm. Cherry emerged from the house carrying the breakfast tray as though it were a coronation procession. The brown Betty teapot and its quilted cozy 2 cups, a plate of scones still faintly steaming, a dish of blackcurrant jam, and a small jug of cream so thick it had to be coaxed with a spoon. There we are, ma'am, she said, setting it down with satisfaction. Though it's more like second breakfast than morning tea at this hour. The postman says the churchyard looks a picture with the frost on Rosemary's grave. Someone's left fresh chrysanthemums every day. Miss Marple poured with her usual steady hand. Evelyn Prentice, I expect. She has a kinder heart than people gave her credit for. Cherry handed her mistress a scone and sat, uninvited but not unwelcome, on the edge of a nearby chair. Well, ma'am, she said cheerfully, unable to contain herself any longer, another murderer caught because of a teapot. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled above the rim of her cup. Not the teapot, Cherry. Human nature. People will always betray themselves over small things, a crushed flower, a half-written letter, a guilty glance at the dregs in a cup. The world is full of poison if one knows where to look. Fortunately, it is also full of scones and common sense and kindly hearts. Cherry buttered her own scone with enthusiasm. The village is ever so quiet now. Dr. Brent started on Monday. Nice young man, listens to your chest with a thing like iced ear trumpets. And they say Mrs. Haydock has gone north for good. The Major's bungalow is all shut up, and Tom Briggs sailed on the Highland Queen yesterday. Evelyn's had the painters in already. Mauve, if you please, and chintz with roses. Miss Marple nodded, gazing across the glittering garden to the church tower rising above the yews. Everyone is finding their proper place again. That is the great mercy of villages, Cherry. We grieve, we gossip, we forgive. And then we get on with the important things. Planting bulbs, baking for the Christmas bazaar, deciding whose turn it is to do the flowers for Advent. Cherry licked a smear of jam from her thumb. And poor Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple's voice softened. He will plead guilty to manslaughter. Sir Henry telephoned last night. 5 years, perhaps 4. He has asked that his medical books be given to the hospital where he trained. Atonement of a sort. She was silent a moment, watching a robin hop along the frozen path. I shall miss our old doctor, she said at last. He brought half the village into the world, and he meant no real harm, only to save what he thought was his good name. A foolish old man who reached for the wrong bottle in a moment of panic. We have all reached for the wrong bottle at some time in our lives, Cherry. Only most of us are fortunate that the results are not fatal. Cherry considered this weighty philosophy, then decided practicality was safer. More tea, ma'am? Thank you, dear. The second cups were poured. Steam curled into the frosty air like incense. Miss Marple raised hers in a gentle private toast. To St. Mary Mead, she said softly, where even murder cannot quite disturb the peace for long. The robin gave a clear, defiant chirrup and flew off towards the churchyard. Somewhere in the distance the clock struck the quarter. Life, having been thoroughly shaken, had settled again into its familiar pattern. Quiet, orderly, and safe. Because one mild old lady with pale blue eyes kept watch over it all from a seat beneath a beech tree, armed with nothing more dangerous than a cup of tea and an unshakable faith in human nature. Cherry gathered the tray. Shall I bring your knitting, ma'am? That scarf for the overseas parcels? In a moment, Cherry. Let me sit just a little longer. The frost is so beautiful, and one never knows how many more Novembers one will be granted. She leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the pale sun warm her face. In the hush, the garden seemed to breathe with her, peaceful, healed, waiting patiently for spring. Gentle strings rise, warm and comforting. Narrator, soft, smiling. And so another mystery is folded away as neatly as a piece of knitting. Another teacup emptied, another danger gently laid to rest beneath the quiet earth of St. Mary Mead. Thank you, dear listener, for spending these autumn days with Miss Marple and with me. Until the next kettle sings and the next secret stirs behind the chintz curtains. Good afternoon. The fire is lit and you are always welcome.